Ani, Bojo, Kwe, Sago, and welcome to the International Indigenous Student Exchange Knowledge Fair. I want to offer tobacco to everybody who's present here tonight as a symbol of thank you for sharing your wisdom, knowledge, and spirit with us tonight. To all the panelists and also to all the attendees. So my name is Carolyn Podruchny, and I had the wonderful good fortune to be the academic lead of this program that brings together Indigenous students from 5 countries: Mexico, Ecuador, the Philippines, Costa Rica, and Canada. So I'm a senior research fellow of the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies at York University. I'm also a professor in the history department and a co-founder of the History of Indigenous Peoples Network. I'm of settler descent. I'm not of Indigenous descent. My great-grandparents came to Canada from Ukraine and Poland. And I have devoted my career and my life to educating the public, the Canadian public and other publics about the histories of Indigenous peoples and colonialism, which are at the heart of the story of Canada and also at the heart of the stories of many other parts of the world. So I'm standing beside some wonderfully capable and brilliant people who made this program happen. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge them here. So Helen Balderrama, who's the Associate Director of International Partnerships and Programs of York International, Mary Rose Talla, who's the Global Learning Coordinator at York International, Katie Gribbins from the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York, and finally, Brianna Berry, the Student Recruitment Officer for the Center of Aboriginal Student Services at York, who's going to be co-chairing this event with me. Brianna.
Ani, Bojo, Kwe, Sago, everyone who has joined us today. I have a good smudge going here for everyone in attendance, and I have some tobacco that I'm offering as well for all of the students and everyone who will be sharing knowledge today. I would like to briefly introduce myself as one of the co-hosts for this evening alongside Carolyn. My name is Brianna Berry. I am an Indigenous woman of Mohawk, Algonquin, and mixed European heritage. I currently hold the position of Indigenous Recruitment Officer at the Center for Aboriginal Student Services at York University, and have been involved with the International Indigenous Exchange Pilot Program as a member of the organizing team, as well as a program facilitator. We would like to start this knowledge fair today with an acknowledgement of the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to the land on which we reside and work on as members of the York University community.
Okay, so we are now going to do actually a housekeeping slide. So Mary Rose, I wonder if you could share the housekeeping slide with us. Thank you. Mary Rose is the brains behind everything, really. So I just want to let everybody know that this event is being recorded, and we're going to be sharing the recording with participants on our website promptly after this is over. We encourage all attendees to ask your questions about the student presentations through the Q&A button. So there's going to be a little bit of time at the end of each presentation, but we'll have a large chunk of time at the end of all the presentations to ask questions. So English, Spanish, and Arabic live interpretation is available through the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. English closed captioning is available at the closed captions button at the bottom of the screen. So Spanish closed captioning is available through the link in the chat that was provided in the chat. And Brianna, over to you.
Absolutely. And just as a content warning for folks in the audience, presentations may include sensitive content, including but not limited to physical violence, race-based violence, discrimination, and personal experiences and accounts of colonialism. We ask that you please listen to the speakers respectfully and note that it is not your place to question their lived experiences. We encourage you to take self-care measures if you become aware of any feelings of distress and to reach out to your support network.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we're next going to do a land acknowledgement, which is something that's traditionally done in Canada, but it's increasingly being done in other parts of the world for events that are Indigenous based. So as this meeting is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement that I'm about to share with you is probably not for the territory that you're currently on. So if this is the case, we ask that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on, and that also the current treaty holders of that territory. So as a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. So York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. This area is actually known as Takaranto, and it has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. So we acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. And this territory is also subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region.
I would also, thank you, Carolyn. I would also like to add a reflection to the land acknowledgement. So I have spent some time reflecting on the land acknowledgement and the spirit behind its crafting. And during this program, I've had the great honor to listen to the many wonderful ways in which different Indigenous students acknowledge the relationships to the territory on which their Indigenous communities reside, and also the relationships with all of the animate forces and beings therein. And it has led me to think about what's said and what's left unsaid when the land acknowledgement is given in an institutional setting, the intentions within and the intentions yet to be realized. When read from a colonial point of view, the land acknowledgement may be read as a mere assertion of land ownership, which I see as an impoverished interpretation of its true spirit. While the land acknowledgement serves as an assertion of claim to territory and the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous nations here in Turtle Island specifically, it is also a vindication of Indigenous peoples' deeply rooted ancestral and continuous relationships to the land and all beings, relationships thousands of years in the making. Our diverse knowledges, our realities, our political and social values, customs, and norms all come from a situated place of embodied interrelation. I feel like the relational aspect and emphasis on creating meaningful, respectful, and reciprocal relationships is often left unacknowledged in a literal reading of the land acknowledgement. So while you are acknowledging the Indigenous peoples on the land on which you reside, I also encourage you to consider your relationship to these peoples. Mckay.
Okay, so let's have the next slide now, which I believe has our agenda for the evening. And we have several people who are going to be doing prayers and greetings for us. So I'm going to ask Brianna to first introduce Randy Pikwatakwit, who will be our first person doing a prayer and greeting.
Absolutely. So Randy Pikwatakwit is Anishinaabe from the Anishinaabe Nation and is originally from the Wakumakong unceded territory located on Manitoulin Island in Northern Ontario. He is the manager of Indigenous Student Services and oversees the support services that the Center for Aboriginal Student Services provides to the Indigenous student population at York University. I would now like to invite Randy to show himself on screen and to open up the event for this evening.
All my relations, greetings. I'm going to provide some words to open this gathering as a Anishinaabe person. Miigwech to Jemnado. So we give thanks to Jemnado, our creator, for the gift of this day and for bringing us together today. Miigwech Mishomis, our grandfather's son. Miigwech to Nokomis, our grandmother moon. Miigwech Shkagmakwe. So we give thanks to Shkagmakwe, our Mother Earth, for all that we have been given, for giving us life, for giving us food, for giving us water, and for giving us breath. So we give thanks to Jandrea for the medicine wheel, which you see behind me, and for all the gifts that these 4 directions represent. This medicine wheel, or the circle of life, is a symbolic teaching tool for many Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, or North America. So this circle, it holds a special it holds a place of special importance, and it reflects the worldviews of many Indigenous nations on Turtle Island. It teaches us the connectedness of everything in life, and the need for balance in the world. It teaches us to be mindful. It teaches us respect and compassion to all of life. So these teachings come from the natural world. These teachings are actually, the natural laws from the natural world all around us. So, so when I'm asked to do openings, I always want to acknowledge and situate us in the medicine wheel. That is, where we are in the circle of life, and to acknowledge the gifts that are given to us in each of these 4 directions. So I know that many of you are who have joined us today are in various locations from all around the world. Here in this location where I'm speaking, we have entered the eastern direction, Wabanam, which is represented by the color yellow. This is the season of spring, and it represents the beginning of life. Where the plant life will soon begin to bud and come to life. It also represents where we begin our human life as we journey from the spirit world into this physical world. So we give thanks to Jandrea, our creator, for these gifts. So again, I want to give thanks to Jandrea for bringing us together, and we ask Jandrea to be with us in spirit, to help us stand strong, to give us guidance and wisdom, and to help us speak and listen well to one another as we come together today to share our stories, to share our accomplishments, and the work of our students who participated in this International Indigenous Student Exchange program. So with that, I say miigwech, 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 miigwech.
Miigwech, Randy, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'd like to now introduce everybody to the Provost and Vice President Academic of York University. So she always gets introduced in this really formal way. She's also my friend. So I always like to introduce her as my friend Lisa, who happens to be the Provost. So prior to her current position here at York, she served as the interim dean at the Bora-Alaskan Faculty of Law at Lakehead University, and then as Associate Vice President Research at York University until 2014. She provides, in her current position, she provides leadership to the senior academic administrative team in the areas of academic planning, institutional change management, the alignment of academic priorities and resources, and strategic enrollment and complement planning. So current initiatives focus on institutional priorities around academic quality, the student experience and student successes, like the program tonight, community engagement, financial sustainability, and also engagement with the York University community. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to provide a greeting for us now.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Much appreciated. I'm very honored to be here and to be your friend and your colleague. And I'm also very grateful to Randy for the opening prayer, and to Randy for the work that you do here as a knowledge keeper and as an educator for all of us at York University. You're a very important pillar of our community, so thank you for that. And just greetings to all. Good evening, Canada, and good morning and good afternoon for those of you who are joining from other parts of the world. It's really a great pleasure for me to welcome you today at this knowledge sharing session of the International Indigenous Student Exchange Program. And I think it is a wonderful, amazing opportunity for listening and learning about your students, your experiences with the program as students, and hearing about your collaborative projects. We are at York University so pleased to have been able to host this pilot program in collaboration with our partners and with support from Canada's Outbound Student Mobility Program Innovation Fund. And as I think you know, this fund is aimed specifically at supporting new innovative models for global learning, as well as increasing access for students who might not have had these kind of opportunities without this sort of innovative pilot. Now, the reason we're so pleased to host this is that it aligns very closely with some of our key priorities at York University. Our new university academic plan prioritizes from access to success, which is where we aim to support students from all backgrounds to realize their full potentials, as well as advancing global engagement, where we recognize that global networks allow students to learn from one another and gain global fluencies that are needed to work in international settings. So based on the feedback that we have received from students and faculty involved with this program, it seems to me that this program has definitely achieved these goals in close collaboration and partnership, and with the help of our cross-campus team, which has been incredible. I have been able to join you for just a couple of sessions, including tonight. On March 10th, I was here for Professor Michael Hill's lecture, and I learned a great deal. It was very, very thought-provoking and insightful. So you have had opportunities for dialogue and collaboration amongst Indigenous students at York and their peers in Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, and the Philippines on topics relevant to the varying experiences of Indigenous peoples and communities, such as spirituality, knowledges, languages, land, identity, and global indigeneity. I want to acknowledge colleagues at York for your very hard work to create this wonderful program and your commitment, and also to acknowledge and thank our partners, the 4 cooperating universities in 4 different countries: Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, University of Costa Rica, Universidad San Francisco de Quito, as well as University of the Philippines, Baguio. At York, my dear colleagues, thank you so much. Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, Center for Aboriginal Student Services, Robarts Center for Canadian Studies, and York International. And I specifically want to mention and acknowledge and thank and congratulate Professor Carolyn Podruchny, my friend and colleague in the History Department in Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, as well as Randy and Brianna and York International for the program's immense success. And I look forward to supporting future editions of this and follow-up initiatives from this great pilot. So thank you, and I'm wishing you all an excellent event tonight.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was wonderful. And I really appreciate hearing about all the detail to help give everybody background to all the presentations. I'll now turn it over to Brianna to introduce Lily.
Absolutely. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Litschko, an Associate Dean of Global and Community Engagement and Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. Litschko brings to her portfolio a commitment to finding ways to connect LAMPS with communities locally and globally. As a first-generation scholar with a research and teaching interest in diaspora and culture, she understands the power of culture to bring together communities across a range of different experiences and histories. She is also an associate professor in the Department of English, where she teaches courses on short story, Canadian literature, and post-colonial theory. Her research has led to books on Chinese restaurants and the relationship between human rights and creative expression. As an associate dean, she supports students, faculty, and community members on initiatives that benefit both the community and the university. And with that, I will pass it over to Litschko.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And I want to just thank Brianna and Carolyn in particular for the extraordinary work that you've put into this program. And I know that this effort was a team effort and it involved many, many, many people. But I appreciate the work that you have brought to leading this initiative. It's my great honor and pleasure just to bring some greetings on behalf of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. I'm very proud that LANPS was one of the key academic sort of cornerstones for this program. We began when we first started brainstorming about how to approach the competition for the outbound mobility funds. We began with the principle that internationalization had to happen hand in hand with indigenization. And for us, this program has been such an extraordinary realization of what can happen when we think of internationalization and indigenization as two key aspects of global learning, and that they have to be thought together. I want to congratulate the students in particular. You took a big risk and a big gamble. We gave you almost no time to think about it. And you met us where we were at. You came to this program with open hearts and open minds, and you learn from each other. And it's been extraordinary to see the learning that has happened. And I want to congratulate all of you on the learning that you're going to share tonight. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to learning from you.
That's wonderful, Lily. Really appreciate it. And thank you once again for your role in securing this grant that got it off the ground. Okay, so let's now go to the next slide, and we're going to start in with the first presentation. And this is Indigenous Knowledges and Technologies in Education. So I want to introduce the three students that are doing this project. So the first is Ángel Solís, who's a third-year mechatronics engineering student at Tecnología de Monterrey in Mexico. He worked in partnership with Quela Wesley, who's a third-year biology student minoring in history at York University in Canada, who's also Cree from Moose Factory. And then also the third person in this project is Felipe Bañez García, who's an undergraduate student at the University of Costa Rica. So I think Ángel will be speaking on behalf of the group. So Ángel, whenever you're ready.
Hola, mi nombre es Ángel y a nombre de mi equipo expondré nuestro proyecto. Elegimos trabajar primeramente en el estudio del conocimiento indígena y las tecnologías contemporáneas. Y para esto decidimos desarrollar un proyecto a través de una galería de Instagram, creando imágenes con algunas iniciativas que se están trabajando para rescatar las lenguas indígenas utilizando plataformas de redes sociales. Nuestras áreas claves son el conocimiento indígena y la tecnología en contextos comunitarios e iniciativas para promover y preservar el conocimiento indígena en las redes sociales. Para comenzar a describir nuestro proyecto, es importante conocer el contexto de las lenguas indígenas. Hay casi 7,000 idiomas y dialectos en el mundo, pero casi solo el 7% se refleja en material publicado en línea. Según la UNESCO, al menos 40% de las 7,000 idiomas utilizados en el mundo están en peligro de desaparecer. Esto ciertamente representa una situación preocupante. Los invitamos a pensar en esto. Imagina que tu plataforma de redes sociales favorita no te permite escribir o publicar en inglés o en español o en tu lengua nativa. Ahora piensa en un teclado que no te permita escribir tus propias palabras. Tendrías dos opciones: cambiar a otro idioma o permanecer en silencio digital. Extrajimos esta reflexión de un reportaje de la BBC, coincidiendo en que esta realidad es la que muchas personas de comunidades indígenas viven día a día. Por ejemplo, las personas de diversas comunidades alrededor del mundo comúnmente dejan de usar sus lenguas porque no saben escribirlas o porque no pueden escribirlas en las plataformas actuales. Y como resultado tenemos la falsa sensación de que las lenguas indígenas no son indispensables en nuestros días. Ahora que sabemos que las lenguas indígenas alrededor del mundo están en serios problemas y en peligro de desaparecer, podemos hablar de la tecnología como una herramienta poderosa para actuar en la preservación de las lenguas indígenas. Pero, ¿cómo utilizar estas tecnologías para transmitir conocimiento de lenguas indígenas? ¿Se están adaptando los pueblos indígenas a los usos occidentales de la tecnología? ¿O los pueblos indígenas estamos encontrando formas de transformar la tecnología alineándolos a nuestra forma de vida? Después de la investigación que desarrollamos para el proyecto, notamos que lo que sucede en la mayoría de los casos es lo primero. Las personas de comunidades indígenas se están adaptando al uso de las plataformas de redes sociales que tenemos hoy en día. Algo interesante es que muchas personas escriben en lenguas indígenas porque están teniendo una especie de conversación encriptada en donde solo los hablantes del idioma la entienden. Centrándonos, en lo que pensamos que la gente está haciendo ahora mismo en Internet para rescatar sus lenguas indígenas y cómo utilizar las plataformas de redes sociales para enseñar a aprender, podemos decir que hoy las lenguas indígenas se están refugiando en Internet para evitar su extinción. Ciertamente, para crear una nueva generación de hablantes de lenguas indígenas, es necesario poner a disposición contenido en nuestras propias lenguas indígenas. Conociendo algunos proyectos que se están desarrollando actualmente en diversas plataformas de redes sociales, decidimos crear Indigenous Languages Online. Esta es una cuenta de Instagram que nos permite publicar proyectos o iniciativas comunitarias a destacar, generar consejos para adaptar y compartir conocimientos indígenas, crear contenido para promover el intercambio intercultural y el empoderamiento indígenas. Hemos diseñado una estructura básica para nuestras publicaciones para facilitar la navegación alrededor de la cuenta, teniendo como principales indicadores el país en donde se desarrolla alguna iniciativa de enseñanza, difusión o creación de contenido en lenguas indígenas, la plataforma en donde se desarrolla, una breve descripción de este proyecto y el enlace a la página web de esta iniciativa. En nuestra cuenta podemos compartir diferentes proyectos que se desarrollan en varias plataformas. Es decir, desde videos que profesores están haciendo en YouTube y TikTok, hasta imágenes que los mismos estudiantes realizan en Facebook, hasta música en Spotify. Con esto, nuestro proyecto no es solo una cuenta de Instagram, es una herramienta de empoderamiento. Es una plataforma para difundir grandes iniciativas. Es un recurso para la preservación de las lenguas indígenas. Es una herramienta creativa para difundir conocimientos y sobre todo es un lugar donde coexiste la convivencia multicultural. Los invitamos a seguirnos y muchas gracias por su atención.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Now I just want to introduce the faculty member who's going to be a commentator here, and that is Professor Michael Hill from the Universitat San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. So he is a professor of anthropology, and he was the founding chair of the anthropology major at USFQ in Ecuador. And his teaching and research interests include tourism, heritage, Andean ethnic identities, organizational anthropology, and life history and collaborative ethnographic methodologies. So Michael.
Great, thank you so much, Carolyn, and thanks to all of our panelists and all the attendees. And I just want to congratulate Ángel and Caleb and Felipe for this fascinating proposal and project and Instagram account that they've created. And I just want to say that I think even in placing at the heart of their topic and their title of their project, the words Indigenous and technologies, they're already making a statement because while those of us inside Indigenous worlds or studying Indigenous studies may understand the breadth and the amplitude of Indigenous technologies, I think we're still, unfortunately, in a situation in dominant societies where we tend to separate those terms into two separate worlds, and we tend to see Indigenous communities as located in some past or in some low tech or no tech sort of context, which is not true at all. And even if we value those alternative technologies, we don't quite realize that we are all living in 2021. And so digital indigeneity, I think, is an important concept that's going to become more and more relevant as time moves on. And that there are technological innovations that we need to pay more attention to by coming from Indigenous communities. And so I think that the project of this group encourages us to see Indigenous technologies as alternatives to, collaborations with, and also decolonizations of the technological and digital worlds in which we live. And so I don't know if any, I think there's a question that's come through. Here's a question that we have for the group. How can the internet support the survival and thriving of Indigenous languages? And how might the internet harm them? So I don't know if Ángel, Felipe.
Hi, folks. I was one of the partners working on this project, and I'll be answering some of the Q&A questions. So the question was, how can the internet be used to kind of revitalize Indigenous languages and bring them into the present, but also how can it pose a threat? And I think that's really interesting because one of the resources that we found was actually a Cree language resource page on Facebook, and it had something like 20,000 members of both language learners and educators sharing resources in their classrooms, and sharing different approaches, different lesson plans, and different content that they've gathered from across their collective experiences. And I think what technology and social media allows us to do is it allows us to collaborate together. And I think that's one of the strongest strengths that technology and social media bring to language revitalization. And I think one of the challenges with that is Indigenous languages are so unique, and they are created in place. So an Indigenous language might look very different in one region compared to another region. So for my own lived experience, Cree is broken up into like 5 or 6 different dialects, and the way that you say hello in one dialect does not match the way you say hello in another dialect. So I think the diversity of Indigenous languages oftentimes makes that collaboration a little bit more difficult. So our diversity is both a strength, but when we want to come together, it can also put up barriers in communication as well. So I think that's one of the challenges to be aware of when organizing in a digital space around Indigenous languages.
Great, thank you so much, Caleb. I think we have time for one more question. Another question that we received is, how do you measure the access and usage of these technological forms and gadgets? Are there many people using them? And if I may add a question, or a related question to that, did your group think any about, or what might you have to say about communities, because of both state and market abandonment, may not have access to connectivity? What sorts of thoughts did your group maybe have about that situation as well?
So I will tackle the first question about measuring access and usage, and then move on to the question about access. Okay, I will write that down. When we were thinking about how do we gauge engagement with these different resources, there's a lot of ways that we can look at it. We can look at it from our end based on the analytics of Instagram. So we can track how many likes we're getting, how many comments that we're getting. But if we also invest in the business aspect of Instagram accounts and set it up so that we are able to get more details around analytics, we're able to track the different types of users that come to our site and say, oh, we're getting a strong youth presence, or maybe we're getting a strong presence from this part of the world. So we'd be able to understand it, the analytics from our end based on the platform that we've used, Instagram. The different resources that we have looked at and that we have begun compiling and sharing, they have their own systems of tracking. So if we look at like a TikTok account, you're able to track how many likes that this post is getting, how many followers this account might have, and that can give us a gauge of how far we're reaching, right? So it really comes down to the analytics and numbers, and that helps us determine our spread and our reach. Now thinking about Michael Hill's question about access, that is one of the challenges that we even thought about. What about where there are communities that don't have internet access? What are things that we can do for that? So I think it speaks to one of the challenges of living in a digital age, and also an age where access to the internet is not equitable. So one of the things that we were trying to do was also include certain print resources that folks would be able to use. We connected with a Anishinaabe-Moin syllabics chart. So if you were able to get access for like one day and take a screenshot of that, you would be able to use that tool in other places without internet access. So there is also another section where we linked to an article that shared specific language learning apps or websites. So if you were able to get access for one day and download a specific language learning app, that could be used offline as well. But it really is optimized for mobile devices and access to the internet. So that's kind of one of those barriers for us as well. But we've tried to incorporate some workarounds, but nothing is ever perfect. I also see that there are other questions, but I also want to be cognizant of time as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Caleb. I think we will need to move on to the next group, but there will be time at the very end of the program tonight, for other questions and answers and discussion. And I just want to congratulate this group, Felipe, Caleb, and Ángel, and also encourage you. I think another thing we could do is put that Instagram handle in the chat box for our panelists and for our attendees so that we can explore the wonderful work you've done on this Instagram account. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it back to Carolyn and Brianna to introduce the next group. Thank you.
Mckay, Michael, Caleb, Ángel, and Felipe for your wonderful thoughts and knowledge that you've shared. I like the momentum that's here with the questions and the Q&A, so we will take note of them and we will ask them at the end. And I would like to introduce our next group, which is presenting on Settler Greed, Indigenous Land, a Comprehensive Timeline. For this presentation, we have Quenses Quela, who is a student at the College of Social Sciences at the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and is Iboloy Kanakani. We have Christina de Costa, who is a second-year student in Indigenous Studies at York University. She is Soto Ojibwe First Nations. And we also have Amy House, who is a fourth-year history major at York University. Amy is both Inuk and Mi'kmaq from Newfoundland and Labrador, and she is a part of the urban Inuit community in Toronto, and is also the vice president for the Indigenous Students Association at York. So we have this wonderful team who will now be presenting, and I will pass it over to them.
So for our final project, we decided to make a timeline to really show the scope of land displacement and dispossession faced by Indigenous people in both Canada and the Philippines. Many people believe that these issues are historical and fail to realize that this is an ongoing issue for Indigenous people. Worldwide, the issues are in fact not only modern, but current, as I'm sure those in so-called Canada have seen. We called the project Settler Greed, Indigenous Land. This is because the crux of all land issues Indigenous people face are directly caused by colonialism, which is an ongoing process. Our timeline is filled with many dates between 1900 and 2020, and yet it is still considered an incomplete timeline. Despite the many cases presented in this timeline, there are probably just as many left out. The three I will present today are the High Arctic relocation, the Hebron relocation, and the LIA land claim. So scrolling down, the High Arctic relocation, which happened in 1953 and again in 1955, was a project of removal. What was portrayed as a humanitarian effort to preserve Inuit culture and ways of life was actually a way for Canada to extend its colonial control and borders to the High Arctic through Inuit settlement. In 1953, Canada forcibly migrated 92 Inuit from Inukjuak, Quebec, and Pond Inlet, Baffin Island to Grise Fjord and Resolute Bay. The government promised them plenty of game and fish, the ability to sustain themselves and their culture and lifestyle. Instead, they suffered being divided from their community members, hunger, extreme cold, sickness, and poverty. It becomes clear that this project was never to benefit Inuit. The event is one in a long history of removals and interference in Indigenous communities and nations, which brings me to the next issue I wanted to discuss tonight. The Hebron relocation in 1959 marked another move by the government to split communities and remove Inuit from their homelands. Hebron, situated in northern Labrador, was long inhabited by Inuit. In 1830, Moravians, a Protestant denomination, saw an opportunity to establish a mission there to force Inuit into permanent settlements and enforce Christianity, as they had elsewhere in Labrador. In 1959, the missionaries, the provincial government of Newfoundland, and the International Grenfell Association made the decision to close the mission and move all Inuit south, without input from any Inuit living in Hebron. The missionaries and officials, in an underhanded scheme, decided to break the news of the closure in a church. By giving the news in a church, they made it so Inuit could not disagree. And so they forced them south to communities that had no homes for them and spread families and community members across 3 towns, Makavik, Hopedale, and Nain. These towns would not grow to include them. Instead, Hebron Inuit would be isolated in crowded villages, having to learn new hunting and fishing grounds, which were already occupied. And the third event I want to discuss tonight is more hopeful than the last two and shows Indigenous resilience and perseverance. The event is actually multiple, but starts with the formation of the Labrador Inuit Association and their land claim. In 1973, the LIA was formed to promote Inuit culture, health, and protect Inuit rights. In 1977, the LIA filed a land claim covering 116,000 square kilometers of land and sea for the Inuit of Labrador, and would start negotiations in 1988 with the provincial government of Newfoundland and the federal government of Canada. In 2004, after 15 years of negotiations, the Land Claims Agreement Act was passed, affirming Inuit self-governance with the establishment of Nunatsiavut and the land claim settlement area of 72,520 square kilometers of land and 48,690 square kilometers of sea. LIA set a precedent for self-governance in land claims, and Nunatsiavut is the first Inuit area to achieve self-governance. Which brings us to our next group member, Christina.
Hi. So I will be the 3 events that I would like to talk about. First, I'm going to start with the James Bay and Northern Quebec agreement. So the agreement was signed in November 1975 by the government of Quebec, the government of Canada, the Ground Council of the Crees of Quebec, and the Northern Quebec Inuit Association. So to give you some background information, after the government had attempted to move forward with creating hydroelectric dams in the James Bay region, mainly Cree communities and Inuit communities aligned together to defend their rights over unceded lands, as the building of those dams would directly affect their livelihoods and their resources to food and also land practices. So after several years of protecting and defending the land and water, while also fighting with the government to dismiss this project, they finally came to an agreement. It took a very long time, and it took a lot of energy from the Indigenous communities. And if you go online, there are some video footages of Inuit people who had to travel down like south in order to be able to go to all the hearings and meetings. And it was really a big impact on their lives and on the families and communities. So they finally came to an agreement with the James Bay Agreement, which a lot of people refer to the modern day treaty. And this was a big pivotal moment in Canadian history because it was a win for the Indigenous communities. And finally, there was like a treaty that was being respected. And so I've included this part of our land project as it's one of many examples where Canadian government disregarded Aboriginal rights and titles and proceeded with large projects that would directly affect Indigenous communities without consulting those communities just for their economic gain. So the next point I would like to move to is the boil water advisories. So boil water advisories are set all across Canada, and there are levels to which water on First Nations communities are contaminated. So there's boil water advisories, there's do not consume advisories, and there's do not use advisories. So to better explain what these advisories mean for these communities, I've taken this directly from the Government of Canada website. And so under their recommendations, boil water advisories advise home users that they should bring their tap water to a boil for a minimum of 1 minute before they can drink the water, use the water for other purposes, such as cooking, to feed pets, to brush their teeth, make soups or ice cubes, wash fresh fruits and vegetables, make infant formula or other drinks. And now during a water boil advisory, you do not use tap water to bathe those who need help, such as infants, toddlers, and elderly, as it cannot be consumed. So boil water advisories are issued when there are problems with the water treatment system, such as chlorine levels that are too low. Water test results confirm the presence of disease such as viruses, bacteria, and parasites. So do not consume advisories are issued when the water system has contaminants like lead that can't be removed from boiling the water. So do not consume advisories are also called to not drink advisories. These advisories tell the public that they should not use their tap water to cook, drink, feed pets, and the same do not make drinks with it. And it also warns the public that they should not use their tap water for any reason whatsoever. So do not use advisories is issued when using the water proposes a health risk. The water system has pollutions that can't be removed through boiling, and being exposed to water through even just bathing could perhaps be due to a chemical spill. So this is a large issue across Canada, as boil and do not consume advisories have been ongoing for 20 plus years in many First Nations communities on reserves. An issue that's not really experienced outside the reserve system. So having these advisories affects many Indigenous people's daily lives, as it's out of their own pocket, in which that they need to purchase bottled water in order to just do everyday tasks that a lot of us like take for granted, in order like us having running tap water in large cities. So this can also affect the land, because if the water is contaminated, it can also be a sign that the land and soil is also contaminated. It can also not be safe to use for watering soil, for planting, gardening, or even for animal life, which directly impacts food sources in a lot of these communities. So in 2018, the federal government did commit funds to eliminate boil water advisories by or before March 2021. And as that's where we are now, or just a little bit past that now. Currently across Canada, there is over 50 do not use advisories still. So their promise to change this has not actually been implemented completely. And there are over hundreds that boil advisories still across Canada, and specifically 44 alone just in the province of Ontario, where that is where I and a lot of my classmates are located in Toronto. So something that we wouldn't even think about, that's something that wouldn't affect our daily life, but affects areas that are just north of our city. And I say that because we hold that privilege, in that Canada has always been viewed as a first world country, but in many Indigenous communities and reserves across Canada, they're living in third world conditions. And this again is due to greed, because the government of Canada has not set enough funds fast enough to be able to put in to be able to put in systems to clean the water, or even provide bottled water for those communities that need it. So now I'd like to show a video that was filmed here in Ontario of a community that is under water boil advisory.
Pleas for help painted on wooden placards greet visitors as soon as they arrive. This is the second time Chief Chris Bañez has returned to the reserve since water quality issues forced his community to evacuate to Thunder Bay last month. The road in passes the cemetery.
You know, we lost so many young people, even the elders that are here, that they never had clean water.
Bañez believes his community's high suicide rate stems from the lack of this basic right.
We were born into a world where we can't rise because of the issues that we face.
The water treatment plant was built in the early 1990s, but after only 2 years of operation, a boil water advisory was put into effect. Now, 25 years later, The community is still waiting for clean drinking water.
Okay, there's the water from just before we evacuated. And this is the water, the bottled water. You see the big difference?
Nearly all of Niskandiga's 300 members left after an oily sheen was detected in the reservoir. Only a few band members remain to keep the homes warm as Canadian Rangers deliver wood and feed the 80 dogs left behind by families now 450 kilometers south. 23-year-old Charla Muniz washes her hands at a hotel without worrying about breaking out into a rash like she does back home.
Here, then there would be like blisters on like parts of the fingers.
Muniz met Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2016 to advocate for clean water. She says she left the meeting hopeful that she'd soon be
Christina, we're not hearing the end part of this video, so
yeah,
maybe,
I think it's just playing from Amy's. So Amy, if you want to exit out of that.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, so as you can see in that video, which was only posted November 2020, so just like under 6 months ago, this is still very much an ongoing problem, and not just for food sources, but also health risk, as the young lady was talking about blisters that she experienced. So now I want to quickly just move on to the Northern Gateway Pipeline. So the Northern Gateway Pipeline is a $7.9 billion project that was proposed by Enbridge to install twin pipelines, which intersected on or near Indigenous communities. These pipelines would create serious issues for those communities. However, they were not consulted by the Government of Canada or Enbridge, even though a lot of parts where the pipelines would be built was on unceded territory or areas that were owned by Indigenous communities. So chiefs in BC made it very clear during one of their meetings that the project was not to take place, and if it was, that they would be trespassing on unceded territories. But this did not stop the government or Enbridge to move forward with their plans. Concerns were put forth by Indigenous communities as there was no consent to use the land, pipeline spills, tanker traffic on the coast, effects on wildlife, culture, water, and food sources. There was also a lot of different aspects of the process of building the pipelines. There was a meeting called by Enbridge with the Canadian government officials and the RMCP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who in their route was a colonial system of policing made to police Indigenous people. And to this day, I've had a lot of reports in racist situations towards Indigenous people. And in that, through media, they labeled Indigenous people as terrorists for the land defenders and land protectors who were opposing the pipeline, which continues to be an issue today. But to wrap up, I would just like to pass it on to my partner so she may share her parts.
Yes, thank you, Amy and Christina. So I will move on to discuss with my presentation. So I will be talking about the context of Cordillera, and Cordillera Autonomous Region, or simply CAR, is situated in the northern part of Luzon in the Philippine Islands, and it comprises 6 landlocked provinces of Abra, Apayao, Benguet, Ifugao, Kalinga, and Mountain Province. This region is home to about 33% of the indigenous people here in Cordillera. Since the Spanish colonial era, CAR has long been considered an important resource base. It has always been targeted for exploration, exploitation, and development projects. In this section, I will walk you through the customary land law of its indigenous people, a few cases that relate to land displacement, and the struggles of the indigenous community to fight for their ancestral land. The indigenous people of Cordillera have their concept of land as granted and entrusted by a creator for everyone to harness, cultivate, sustain, and live on. This view promotes the spirit of collectivism and the interconnectedness of the land to the existence of people and their ancestry. To understand the context of their beliefs, as in the words of Mckay Dulag, a Kalinga Pangat or warrior chief, to claim a place is the birthright of every man. The lowly animals claim their place, how much more a man? Man is born to live. Apo Kabunyan, Lord of us all, gave us life and placed us in this world to live human lives. And where shall we obtain life? From the land. To work the land is an obligation, not merely a right. In tilling the land, you possess it. And so land is a grace that marks to be nurtured. Land is sacred. Land is beloved. From its womb springs our Kalinga life. Despite the existence of customary land laws, state policies such as the Public Land Act of 1902 allowed the American government to expropriate all public lands. The Land Registration Act of 1905 established the Torrens titling system as the side basis of land ownership. Even after the American occupation, legislations and proclamations declared that Cordilleran ancestral lands were open for leaseholders, military reservations, watersheds, and resettlement dispossessing them in their territory. Although there were few policies that favored the indigenous people, such as were in the case of the vegetable farmers in Benguet province. Now I will move to discuss a few projects that have displaced or threatened to displace indigenous people in the Cordillera. Ambuklao Dam is one of the very first hydroelectric power plants constructed in the Philippines during the 1950s, and it is located in the mountains of Bukod, Benguet province. Its construction displaced about 300 families and caused the siltation of the nearby river. It also submerged vast rice fields and agricultural lands of the Ibaloys. After the completion of the project, there remain uncompensated properties submerged by the dam, issues on the non-relocation of IPs, and non-compliance to provision on employing locals in the power plant. Second, the proposed Chica River project in 1965, covering 4 dams along the Chica River from Tabuk to Tinglayan and to Sabangan. From 1973 to 1974, the Marcos regime proceeded with its feasibility study and conducted surveys without the knowledge of the indigenous people settled in that area. It was not until the survey was conducted that people came to know about the proposed Chico Dam. According to the study of Delina, the construction of the Tabuk facility alone could have led to the complete submergence of 6 barangays. In response, the indigenous leaders organized the Bodong Federation, an alliance to collectively oppose the project and produce an agreement, which is the Pagtatibodong, which consolidated the resistance of the Kalinga and Bontoc indigenous peoples. Mckay Dulag served as a spokesperson of the formed alliance. But in 1980, military agents in the Army's 4th Infantry Division, led by Lieutenant Leodario Adalem, opened fire on Mckay's home in Bugnay, municipality of Tinglayan in the province of Kalinga. Concerning his murder, subsequent efforts to fight for the land persisted. As a result, the Marcos government and the World Bank were pushed to abandon the Chico Dam project. Decades after the struggle of the indigenous peoples to protect their land from the Chica River project, there arises another set of developments that continue to threaten and dispossess the Cordilleran people of their ancestral lands, particularly reflected in the descent of the people from Ifugao to the construction of the Alimit project and the people of Cabugao Apayao to Ganedwan hydroelectric power plant in the present. So the mentioned cases in this project are some of the many challenges indigenous people from Canada and the Philippines had to endure or continue to face in the modern days. Whether in the context of Canada or Cordillera, we can see the neglect and controversy of the land rights of the indigenous people. This has always been evident. Therefore, land displacement or dispossession of indigenous ancestral lands then and now remains a pressing issue. So the fight of the indigenous people for their land continues till today. Thank you, and this will mark the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much, Quenses, Amy, and also Christina. We'd now like to invite Leticia Nira, who is from Mexico City. She is currently a professor of cultural studies as well as argumentation at Tec de Monterrey, to give her remarks on the presentation.
Thank you, Quenses, Christina, Amy, for this very interesting project. Definitely, it's heartbreaking to see all this abuse that indigenous communities have suffered. I'm going to be very brief. Your timeline, it's only portrays 1 century, but it's obvious that this is something that comes from very long time ago, and it continues nowadays. So the cases you present is something that definitely shakes our head and brings us to different times in history. You talk about abuse, and I think we also need to think about the silence from different parts of the of people around. Sometimes the ignorance, people who do not know about all this happening. But what I would like to highlight, and something I really like about your project, is this idea of how the indigenous communities are an example of resilience and perseverance to obtain, to get back, to claim their rights and to protect their land that it's definitely that belong to them. Thank you very much. Definitely required a lot of work, what you just presented to us, and it's I give a big applause to this fantastic project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Letitia. Thank you so much to the students of that group. We're going to save the questions until the end and just keep moving on to the next presentation. And after the next presentation, we're going to take a 5-minute break, just so the audience knows. So our next presentation is called The Language of the Land. And the 3 students that are going to be presenting this, that put together this project, are Samay, Áinaguano, Baltazar. Sorry, Samay, I probably mispronounced your last name. She studies architecture at San Francisco de Quito University, and she is Quechua from the community of Chibulio. The second student who's part of this group is Aleria Mckay. She is a 3rd-year theater major at York University, and she's also doing an Indigenous Studies minor. And the 3rd student is Rosalyn González Mora, who is a 3rd-year student at the University of Costa Rica. And actually her translator, Merlin, is going to be, I think, speaking on her behalf. So I'll hand it over to the group now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aleria Mckay, and I am from 6 Nations of the Grand River, Ontario, Canada. I'm Haudenosaunee and Temayagama Anishinaabe on my mother's side, and Dene Ta and Métis on my father's side. For my group's project, we wanted to talk to traditional language speakers from our respective groups to learn about their thoughts and opinions on language revitalization, keeping the language alive, how to keep it alive, and why this is so important to our cultures. For my interviews, I asked my mother and some uncles some questions on Anishinaabemowin and our community. We're from Ducky-Manan, which is our traditional land located in Northern Ontario. We have our own unique dialect and culture that, while similar, still differs greatly from the various Anishinaabe nations across Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and the northeastern states. Our traditional land has many provincially recognized landmarks, such as Lady Evelyn Provincial Park and Maple Mountain, one of the highest points in Ontario. Maple Mountain, Chibajing, as it is called in our language, is also one of the most sacred sites that we have, as this is where we believe that spirits go after death. While our community doesn't have very many fluent speakers left, we still have many community members, including myself, who are working hard to relearn what has been lost. We're also lucky to have so many resources and language learning opportunities, both within schools and elsewhere in our community. I hope you enjoy the words of my mother and uncle in our presentation and learn more from my group mates and their interviews. I will now be passing on to Samay for her introduction.
Hi, my name is Samay, Ainaguano Baltazar. I am from the Quichua Chibuleo community, which is located in the province of Tungurahua in Ecuador. For my interview, I interviewed my aunt and my mother. So they described me a lot of things about our language here in Chibuleo. I will describe a little some facts of Chibuleo. For example, Chibuleo is a Quichua community located in the province of Tungurahua in Ecuador. The language that is speaking in Chibuleo is part of the Quechua nationality. The language that is speaking in Chibuleo is Quechua. That's the language that only we use vowels like A, I, and U. Currently, the International Bilingual Education System has unified this language, so the speakers can improve their way of speaking Quechua. According to the latest studies, Quechua has a high percentage of the indigenous population belonging to this nationality, but neither children nor young people are practicing the language because their parents have preferred to teach them the Spanish because in order to prevent them from being discriminated. In Chibuleo, as in other indigenous communities here in Ecuador, all inhabitants must respect the three basic principal rules that are Amayuya, Amashua, and Amaquilla, which translated to English, it will be like don't steal, don't lie, and don't be lazy. So those are the three principles rules that all the communities practice during our life.
Hi, hope you are doing great. Rosalyn couldn't be here today, but I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Boruca culture. Well, the Boruca are an indigenous people living in Costa Rica. The Boruca are also called Brunca, Brunca, and Borunca. They are characterized by their amazing wooden mask. Also, they stand out for their culture and traditions, such as the Diablitos game. Besides, the Boruca identity reflects a deep respect for the stories told, the nature that surrounds them, and the community they share. Also, the Boruca language has suffered problems over the years because the arrival of the colonizing language has caused the forgetting of the language and its importance. Older adults were the only ones who could establish a conversation with each other. But in 2019, the last fluent speaker died. Since that year, the Ministry of Public Education has implemented programs on the subject of Brunca language so that children do not forget the language. However, this subject is only taught in school, which makes it difficult for secondary school students to try to recover their language in some way. Despite the loss of the language, phrases, songs, and even the prayer translated into the Brunca language are known. This prayer is difficult to forget for almost everyone. And thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Merlin. First of all, I want to thank you for having us, Madeline and me, who are the translators of Rosalyn. As Madeline said before, Rosalyn couldn't get into the meeting today, but as Madeline explained before, she just read some of the notes that Rosalyn made about her part of the presentation. In relation to what Madeline said before, the Ministry of Public Education, it is the national institution in charge of education. And as Madeline said before, since the last fluent speaker died in 2019, this national institution wanted to implement some strategies to keep this language alive. Also, Rosalyn explained us that it is really important, and one of the main challenges for them is to keep alive the language, even though if they are not fluent speaker. And one way to do it is to teach children who are the little ones of this community to value their language and keep it in their hearts so they can get interest in the future since they are children now to continue with this language and avoid the deleting of the language because that's a shame for sure. And as I mentioned before, they just speak some phrases and words, but they have the intention of keeping this language alive in the future by the implementation of these strategies by this national institution. Thank you so much.
Amajuja, Amashua, Amakija.
All right, thank you so much to these students. I want to turn it over now to one of our faculty facilitators. And so I'd like to introduce Gabrielle Fletcher from Deakin University. Dr. Gabrielle Fletcher is Gundungurra, traditional custodian from the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia. She's an associate professor in Indigenous Studies and the director of National Indigenous Languages Education Research and Innovation Institute at Deakin University. And her teaching and research has contributed to developing cross-cultural, interdisciplinary, and collaborative understandings of the fields of Indigenous knowledges, creative writing, and textual forms. So she's grounded by her experience in Indigenous community and the responsibilities of remembering. All right, Gabrielle. Looks like we might have lost Gabrielle. I think she might be having trouble with her connection. Let's give her another second. Oh,
is that better?
Yep, great.
Sorry, I do apologise for that. Thank you so much, Caroline. It's an honour for me to be here today, and although it's a little bit early, I'm still Thursday morning here in Australia. I can confirm it's never too early to be excited. And indeed I am. Thank you so much, Aleria, Samay and Rosalyn, for your thoughtful presentation on a really key area of Indigenous knowledge, that is the connection and relationship of land and language. In receiving your presentation, I was struck from the outset by the acknowledgement of your knowledge keepers, which is respectful, of course, and appropriate, but it's also a mark for me of co-construction, co-actioning to this work and beyond. And this resonates immediately as a voice of community, and one of the many challenges traditional language reclamation, revitalisation and maintenance is that it is so often community driven with little funding to realise significant traction and meaningful empowerment. So your work and its urgency is very much underscored, and you have really recognised and framed community immediately. So well done. On that note, I very much enjoyed hearing you speak of your traditional language speakers who are positioned to speak authoritatively because they have lived and continue to live their arguments. Your recognition of this and their inclusion is a great strength to your presentation. Well done, and my respects to your knowledge keepers. You have also provided very helpful contextual background in raising some of the sociocultural and socio-political tensions and nuances in why traditional languages have been silenced, or in usage there is silencing in favour of colonisers' languages, who have made clear that this is contemporary real and not something that is consigned to the past. Language reclamation is at once a political act, but also one of preservation and a way of really dimensioning and understanding and living those deep relationships with identity, place, belonging, worldviews and knowledge. And you've made this really clear. I also very much enjoyed your inclusion of the soundscape. This provided a sense of immersion, certainly for me, and moved beyond a device to re-articulate the interconnection of language throughout, or language and land, pardon me, throughout. It sounded very nice, but I think it worked at a much deeper level and dimensioned your work as a constitutive reminder of the sentient and sapient nature of everything in the land, waterways and airways, and that traditional language transmits the notion that all is knowledgeable, a very important concept for us as human stewards in this expanse of what is knowledge and how we learn and know ourselves from outside in. You'll trace through three different language groups across Ecuador, Canada and Costa Rica. The detail and range of these three traditional language groups was well articulated and captures diversities of languages and the complexity of linguistic sovereignties, and also the importance of situating language within land as context in generating meaning. I learned a great deal and wanted to know more, actually. I would have liked to have heard the three of you, just to move a little bit beyond this, perhaps in dialogue with each other, and finding some intersections and synergies between your own language groups and those experiences. It's a kind of conversation between the three of you to reflect upon how you might feel as a subjective experience. And I also note that you have presented bilingually, which is fantastic. So I wondered how that might fit or sit as well something to consider perhaps for future work. Perhaps. Again, congratulations and thank you, Aleria, Samay and Rosalyn. A strong, informative and insightful presentation with a very powerful community message, unpacking the complex relationships and relationalities between language and land, identity, place, worldviews, and the coalescence of knowledges and knowing, and the challenges of dislocation, migration as well, and the urgent need for generating transgenerational pride and usage in the place of rights. Finally, you presented also some strategies for reclaiming survivance of language that is empowering and agential. Well done, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are wonderful comments. And I'm sure that the students are really grateful to hear them. So just in the interest of time, we're going to save the questions and answers till the end of all of our presentations. We're now going to pause for a 5-minute break. It's currently 8:30, so we'll come back at 8:35 and we'll hear the remaining 2 presentations. And during the break, we're going to actually play the students' film one more time so that you get a chance to absorb it even more. So thank you and see you in 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. And on that note, we are back with the next presentation, which is Disrupting the Colonization of Everyday Life. This presentation will be presented by Sara Fuentes, who is a 4th-year student in International Relations at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. We also have Elizabeth Best, who is a PhD student in history at York University. Elizabeth is Métis and Vietnamese. And then we also have, as the 3rd student member, Jennifer Rokaya Sedgewick, who is a 2nd-year PhD student in marketing at the Schulich School of Business at York University. Jennifer is Métis and English from Treaty 6 in Saskatchewan, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and her ancestral communities include Prince Albert, Batoche, Fish Creek, and the Red River settlements. And on that note, I will pass it over to the student presenters.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Best, and I'm going to introduce our overall project, which Jennifer is going to control the screen share of. And we're going to try to transition from my presentation to Sarah's presentation to Jennifer's presentation as quickly as possible. Our zine is a direct conversation about how we each disrupt colonial spaces. We all come to very similar conclusions from very different Indigenous experiences. And our zine reflects that through art, fashion, and photography, as well as prose. So for my presentation, when I started the exchange classes online, I was working on a couple of beaded patches in conjunction with like my business and my launching of a website. And so when I was beading these pieces that you'll see, I was listening to the conversations that we were having with this class, and it just kind of led really organically into this project. So you'll see Jennifer will have control over the screen, and you'll see my pieces as I read my prose out loud. And then when I'm finished, Sarah will take over. And then when Sarah's finished, Jennifer will take over. So my piece is called Happy is Resistance. Colonial processes have always defined my life in ways that are seen and unseen. I'm a survivor of Canada's genocidal program to assimilate Indigenous children through so-called welfare policies. Whether or not my mother wanted to give me up when I was born is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that Canada's child welfare system alienated me from community and culture. I was raised by non-Indigenous folks who accept systemic racism as fact. They did nothing to instill pride in where I came from. In fact, they did their best to convince me that alcoholism, sex work, and an inherent inability to raise my own children are characteristics of the blood that flow through my veins. Colonialism is all-encompassing. Liberal, conservative, left, right, provincial, federal, they're all levels of a system that erase Indigenous history and perpetuate colonialism in Canada. I'm not the person who will solve colonial narratives. I will never see a world that is free of colonialism. I'm trying to be a happy, functional human in a world where my happiness is not important to the people who judge me by my skin color. The best I can do is break the cycle of poverty, depression, and reliance on a genocidal state system that defines my family history. I am an urban Indigenous two-spirit person living in the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral Nations. As mixed-race Vietnamese and Métis, I'm constantly expected to justify my position because the government deems me Native enough for the child welfare system, but not Native enough to give me a card. I had a confusing trail of guardian placements between Edmonton, Saskatoon, Regina, Moose Jaw, and Manitoulin Island. It's fair to be confused about who I am. I'm a person in between, except that my Indigenous identity is inscribed on my skin and in my hair and in my eyes, and it's obvious that I'm not the mainstream. My mixed identity makes people so uncomfortable that the most common form of racism that I face daily is to be ignored. Maybe that's why I'm pursuing a PhD, because the title doctor is the only way your people will take what I have to say seriously. I study Canadian and Indigenous history. I often feel like I'm living in an alternate universe where my experience is so outside the Canadian narrative that I don't actually exist. One time, a person very close to me told me that my experiences in child welfare would be the same if I was white. And I really believed that for some time. Then I realized that this person never really listens to what I say, and they will never see me as an expert in the history of my people. Colonialism is forcing survivors to convince you of the validity of their lived experiences. Through books, through articles, and through lines on a CD. I have to prove to you that what I'm saying has colonial impact. The irony is that my child welfare experiences led me to a PhD so early. I have the rest of my life to use your tools to dismantle your systems. One more paragraph. Art is the best way for me to explain what I experience to people who have trouble with the reality that I live. Resistance is who I am. Every day I resist by being present, by participating in a system that tries to break me down into easily digestible parts to make you comfortable. Looking to me to solve your problems because I survived your system is not okay. My existence and my art are resistance. Beaded art is time consuming, it's special, and it's part of my journey. Beading is how my people express themselves since time immemorial. The fact that I know this skill despite my cultural alienation is resistance. All I can do is make space for the next survivor to come along and continue the fight. To resist is to live my truth no matter how complicated it is. Resistance is finding ways to serve my community. Resistance is finding love and happy to replace trauma and hurt. Happy is resistance.
I want to say thank you to my friend Elizabeth. That is a fantastic part. And with that, I'm going to start with my presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Sara Fuentes. I am a Quichua Otavalo from Ecuador. This is a country located in the middle of the world, and my community is in the northern part of this country. The project that I prepared for you today is called Iluman Yaku Warmicuna, which is translated from Quechua to English into Women of the Water. The series of photographs were created in honor of the indigenous Quechua women of Iluman. Iluman is my community, who fought back in the 80s to protect the water that kept their community alive. This type of narratives are often hidden from textbooks on platforms of recognition. Me, as an indigenous woman from this community, I want to honor my grandma, who showed me a different type of leadership. Due to women like her, there are more women that are encouraged to take up spaces and also promote the growth of our communities and future generations. I created a series of photographs that show the spaces and also the symbols that are sacred and important to our communities, especially to my community. In this first picture, we can see the name of one of the water springs of my community, which is called San Juan Poggio. That is the name that our community has known this water spring for. In this picture, we can see the art, an art which is engraved on the wall of one of the places close to this water spring. We can see a volcano, which is very important for my community and very sacred to us because we are connected to the story of this volcano. Also, we can see some details which represent the presence of wise healers in my community. These bracelets are very important because they represent the wealth, power, and also kinship of our women. Because in some cases, these are past generations to other generations. So, for example, I have mine from my grandma and also from my mom. This is the water spring that I was talking about. Back in the day, women used to come here, women from the community, to wash their clothes, to wash themselves, and also to spend some time here creating community. This is San Juan Poggio. So I want to talk about three main values that are part of the fight of the women that are often excluded from spaces of recognition, as I said before. And the first principle that I want to talk about is Shuk Makiwan, which means with one collective hand. Around the story that I prepared for today, I want to read the following. Growing up, my grandma used to tell me stories every time I went over to her house to eat. One of the stories that brought her so much collective pride was the one time she defended, along with other women, the water spring from her community. It is known as San Juan Poggio. This water spring comes from the depths of the earth. And at that time, many used this water for their sacred rituals, to clean themselves and to wash their family's clothes. So here are some of the pictures. I want to emphasize in this one because it has one of the components of this picture is the rock that you see there. It is a sacred rock. It's called Buka Rumi, which means red rock, and it has a story behind it And it's also part of the sacredness of this place. This is where a lot of the wise people make their rituals. And the second principle that I want to mention is Shukshunguwang, which means with one heart. Following the story that I was telling you, the authorities were taking their water source little by little to feed other emerging cities. Some leaders alarmed the community of this injustice because the community was being left with no water. This started a confrontation with the police. Many thought that if women were sent to stand in the water spring, the police would not hurt them. But the repression continued, and the police started throwing tear gas to these women. In these pictures, I want to highlight the belt, which is very important, a very important piece in our clothing. It has different designs and stories and colors. And in this other picture, I wanted to highlight the coral, these bracelets that are made out of coral. They are very expensive, but also have a lot of meaning, as I mentioned before, because they represent kinship and also beauty and wealth and power as well. This other picture, I wanted to highlight the necklaces. They are also a sign of wealth. The meaning has been changing from generation to generation. So now it's not like, it doesn't represent wealth necessarily, but it is a part of our clothing as well. Finally, I want to talk about this last principle, which is called Shukriyawang, with one mindset. Again, following the story, the confrontation stopped after the community defeated the police. Our water is the result of a group of women thinking about the future of their generations. Today, there are descendants of these women that beyond looking for recognition, they aimed to provide the best for their families. Leadership can look very different everywhere, and small acts such as this are also political. Thank you for your attention, and thank you again.
All right. Tanche Kiwao. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Roquea Sedgewick, and my section's titled Fashion as Resistance. Just give me a moment here. All right, so throughout my section of the zine, I discuss how resisting or disrupting colonialism is not only achieved through formal collective actions like demonstrations or street protests, but also through everyday actions such as our fashion choices. And so I begin with a few examples of Indigenous peoples, engaging in this type of disruption, this type of resistance. So I'll just cover a couple of the examples here. So starting at the top, this is a article this is something that happened in February of this year, where Rawiri Waititi, who is a Maori MP in New Zealand, was ejected from Parliament for refusing to wear a necktie, which is a mandatory dress requirement for men politicians. He referred to this as a colonial noose, and instead was wearing a haitiki around his neck. So you can see him on the left at the top right there. He declared that this party will not be subjugated nor assimilated to dated colonial rules. And this type of resistance resulted in him winning the Thai War. So this was actually removed from the requirement for men in Parliament. Going down to the bottom here is a different example. It occurs, I think it's the second week of November every year, or every year since at least 2011, where Indigenous peoples will upload pictures of themselves wearing moccasins in colonial spaces such as schools and workplaces to social media under the hashtag #RockYourMocks. So I know my picture is quite small at the bottom there, but if afterwards you look up hashtag #RockYourMocks on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you'll find lots of examples and lots of beautiful beadwork with those moccasins too. CBC covered this in 2020, interviewing Ashley Daniels, who's Dakota Ojibwe, who participated in this movement. And she states in the interview, "I'm showing my representation in public spaces, including social media, just to be reminded that we, Indigenous peoples, hold these spaces too." So in the next section, I discuss the ways that fashion and self-expression have been politicized by colonial institutions. In Canada, for instance, appearances that are considered normal, appropriate, or professional are currently grounded in Eurocentric norms and values, whereby anyone with clothing or hairstyles that deviate from these norms are often penalized. So, for example, through like playground bullying or workplace microaggressions, hiring discrimination, promotion discrimination. You don't have to get too creative to think of a lot of the ways that this actually has impacts in everyday life. And so essentially any deviation from this standard, from this norm, is resistance in itself. And so the second half of my contribution discusses how I find decolonizing my closet meaningful, significant, just based on how colonialism has impacted my family. I don't think, or for the sake of time today, I can't read that. I don't think I can summarize that experience in a way that I guess is comfortable for me. And so if you're interested in it, you can check out the zine. But otherwise, I'll just end with a reading of my last page and on this photo. Today, I adorn myself with beadwork by Indigenous artists, use makeup by Indigenous-owned brands, and wear clothes by Indigenous designers in my everyday life. My self-expression, just hold on one moment. Okay. My self-expression, as I hope I've articulated in my zine contribution, is not just an aesthetic choice, it's an intentional political statement. When I proudly wear my beaded earrings, when a Maori MP trades his necktie for a Haititi, or when thousands of Indigenous peoples rock their mocks within colonial spaces, it symbolizes that Indigenous peoples are disrupting the very institutions that have historically, and albeit continuously, tried to deny us from entering. Aside from its symbolism towards the public, for me, it's a personal reminder of the emotional, mental, and spiritual work that I've done to embrace my cultural pride and identity. This pride in myself and my people fuels my spirit with power and resilience as I navigate the physical and bureaucratic spaces of academia where I'm undertaking graduate studies. Although it may not resemble a petition or protest, Indigenous peoples representing their authentic selves through their own fashions and self-expression is a silent but deeply symbolic political statement, both confronting and disrupting colonial narratives of normative dress through ordinary, everyday actions. That's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Jennifer, Elizabeth, and Sarah. Your words are extremely powerful, and I really admire all the bravery that you brought to this project and all of the vulnerability. And I also want to echo how beadwork, how and also how fashion and our self-expression plays a huge role in showing that we still exist and that it is our existence that is our resistance, and also our resilience and our resurgence. And on that note, I will pass it over to Professor Consuelo Fernandez Salvador from Universidad San Francisco de Quito, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. Her research interests have focused on ethnopolitics, extractivism, and development, particularly around large-scale mining in the southern Amazon region in Ecuador.
Thank you, Brianna. And thank you, Elizabeth, Sara, and Jennifer. I was profoundly moved and touched by your presentation. And I wanted to first thank you for letting us into these very intimate spaces of resistance. I also wanted to say that as a mestizo privileged woman in the Ecuadorian society, it would really not be, I wouldn't want to say and admit that I can share or understand your experiences as Indigenous women, but I do constantly make an effort to empathize and also overall show respect towards the experiences that you've had as Indigenous women in colonized contexts. So having said this, I wanted to say a few comments about your presentation. First of all, I think it's very important what you've said about resistance, identity, reaffirmation of identity, collective identity, and finding other ways of precisely doing that resistance. I think we are very much used, especially in the discussion around ethnopolitics, for example, which is very common in Ecuador. We're very used to looking at resistance only in terms of this notions of direct struggles, protests, like Jennifer was saying before. And in Ecuador, we've had a long history of Indigenous mobilization. Last year, we just had a very strong national Indigenous mobilization against the government. But I do think it's very important to also find these other spaces of resistance, which are, I guess, in many ways, even more symbolic. And they also achieve, I think, this objective of visibility, which I think is being done by fashion, by adornments, by all these very symbolic charge artifacts. So I think this is very important. I also think it's important, the role of women in activism. As Sara was pointing out in Iluman, it was pretty much the women who defended the use of water in the community. And I think sometimes that tends to be devalued also, especially in Indigenous organizations in Ecuador. So I wanted to point that out as a very important point. And the other important point that I think it has to be shown up right now is the issue of identity, and how important is also collective identity, the collective notion of sharing the notions of cultural characteristics, but also sharing certain notions of exclusion from the wider society. And before asking the question that I've been fed from the questions and answers section, I wanted to ask you, what has this course has meant to you in sharing experiences with different students and different people from Indigenous societies and communities in different parts of the world? Maybe you are sharing certain things, and maybe you're also being exposed to different perspectives and to different experiences. So how has this experience been interesting and important for you in shaping your own sense of indigeneity? How has it helped you in constructing your and reaffirming your own sense of being Indigenous women? That's my first question, and then I'll ask another question that has been fed from the quick cues and answers. I don't know who wants to answer that first.
I can go first. Or the ways in which the course has impacted my life, or what I've learned from the course, is, how many similarities we all have from all of our different nations and, places, and also the differences. I mean, for what I've thought, or how it's impacted my identity, I guess, because I noted pretty heavily in my section of the zine that I'm also a disconnected or reconnecting Indigenous person because of the 60 scoop in Canada. But yeah, I feel like it's made me feel very whole, but also kind of identified some of my gaps, like talking about language is more like a concept versus like something I feel like I have like real things to contribute. Yeah, so that's been my experience.
I don't know, Sara, Elizabeth, do you want to share something?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Consuelo. Well, in my case, it's been a process as well of reaffirming my identity with every class, every person that I talk to. Having this type of opportunity where you can meet people from different parts of the world and get to know about their cultures and their ways of resistance has been very, very powerful. And also having the space to share stories such as the ones that I shared with you this night. Well, for me, it's nighttime. It's been very encouraging. Because a lot of people write about us or speak for us, but I think there are many other members of the community, not just us, that can talk about these stories that make you feel more proud of who you are, and also how much you have to learn. I don't think that I know everything about my community, but just having this kind of a space has put me in a place of humility where I start from this perspective that I want to listen. I want to listen to my Indigenous friends and also be there for them. Yeah, it's been a process, and I think it will continue to be because with every story, every program, every class, we're building something that empowers you and that gives you that ability to be in positions of leadership. Leadership meaning as like having this kind of horizontal relationships, not like this vertical relationships with others, but that kind of leadership. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Elizabeth?
I'm actually a very happy person most of the time. So I'm very easy to laugh, but I'm also very easy to cry. So my crying has like nothing to do with how I feel. I actually feel like very angry about this, and like my anger turns into tears. But anyways, something I learned about from this course is that multiple women who are in this cohort are trilingual, which is like incredibly fabulous. They're learning their Indigenous language, they know English, and in many cases they know Spanish. So like I'm in awe of the women and the men that participated in this program, because they're participating across cultural lines and language barriers. And I've learned so much from the people participating in this group. But from my own perspective, I'm also like struggling to figure out where my own leadership position is, and like having more confidence in what I do know and what I don't know, and like being more honest about where I'm at in my journey. And unfortunately with me, it comes at the cost of being like really confusing and constantly having to reevaluate how I introduce myself. And I guess what I learned from this is that a lot of people have that issue. A lot of people across the continent and across the world have a hard time expressing what indigeneity means to them, even though we know that we're Indigenous. We live in a world where we have to convince other people about it.
Thank you. I guess just to finish this off and continue with the next presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to say that the process of identity, of construction of identity, it is a process. It's not essential. You're not born with it. And so I guess it's a process of learning, of adjusting, of reaffirming, but also of becoming visible. And I think that's what's been very important about your presentation. This visibility about everyday actions, not necessarily, like I said before, in big struggles, but just, wearing something that makes you and identifies you as an indigenous person. With this, I finished, but with the example that Jennifer showed in the last part of the presentation, reminded me of the first congressman, the first indigenous congressman in Ecuador, who came to the first session wearing his hat. And he was attacked by a mestizo congressperson because he was wearing the hat. He basically just threw the hat off and said, what are you doing? We're here in a formal session. You can't be wearing your hat. That wasn't the first and the only example. Other people have experienced the same thing. So I think sometimes it might even take more bravery and more courage to do these small acts of resistance and visibility than engage in like this huge political protest as a group. So I just wanted to thank you all for sharing, like I said, all these intimate spaces of resistance.
Thank you so much to that group. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Consuelo. So we're going to turn now to our final session of the evening, and it's called Bringing Spirituality into the Academy. So the three students that did this project are Jandrea Rose Oddoc, who's a third-year history major and philosophy minor at the University of the Philippines. The next one is Jennifer Bolton, who is a PhD student in history at York University and also a member of the Anishinaabe Beausoleil First Nation. And then finally, Emma Litschko is a student from the Indigenous Studies program at York University, and she is from the Mi'kmaq Nation. All right, so take it away.
So a pleasant day or a pleasant evening to everyone. Our topic focuses on Indigenous spirituality, specifically on bringing Indigenous spirituality into the academe as a methodology or contribution to the academic knowledge. We formulated 3 questions for this project to explicate this topic, and we, as a member of both an Indigenous community and the academy, will answer the queries based on experiences and Indigenous knowledges. I am Jandrea from Kalinga, Philippines, and I will be answering the first question. Before going to the main discussion, let me briefly define what is Indigenous spirituality and its misconceptions based on the discussions we had from one of our sessions. Crucial in the Indigenous spirituality is the view that everything is interconnected with each other and with the ecosystem. In this, there is humanization of elements, where elements are perceived to be living entities which are treated with respect and importance. This is often mistaken as 1, mere superstition because of the inclusion of spirits and scientifically unproven beliefs which is present in the practice. 2, it is seen as anti-development mainly because of the contradicting principles between the indigenous peoples and the concept of modernity. And 3, it is reduced as spectacle, that is, spirituality being subjected to curiosity and entertainment. Now, Indigenous spirituality can be seen in Indigenous practices as well as in traditional stories. Grounding from the subject of spirituality, the first question is, can our spirituality and stories influence how we think in academia? Let me start by sharing with you a gist of the Moccasin Sleeper, a traditional story shared by Jen Bolton, a groupmate in this project. The story is about a young girl who makes a journey to get medicine for her village. She is challenged with the obstacles on the way, from walking barefoot in the snow up to the ice cutting her feet, but still managed to go on. One value to take from this is community responsibility, either towards social change or bringing back to the society a product of their knowledge. It is also speaks a lot about working towards and reaching the ultimate goal. As a second point, Indigenous knowledge or spirituality serves as a guiding principle for us on how we situate ourselves in the academe. Some important aspects of Indigenous spirituality are humility, respect, and openness, especially when dealing among elders and other members of the community. There is also an utmost respect when encountering Indigenous knowledge and ideas. In the academe, there are principles and ideas that contradict our principles as well as our knowledge. Some may be right and some wrong, but sometimes intellectual openness can serve for successful academic undertakings. Further, we situate ourselves using these values as we conduct research studies. We have to be humble, to respect sources, especially when doing an interview to people, and to be intellectually open to whatever knowledge they impart and take it unbiased. The third point, Indigenous knowledge of knowing and doing things, especially in the aspect of spirituality, can be adopted in academic undertakings. Indigenous worldviews, which is also an aspect of Indigenous spirituality, for instance, can be used to analyze how things or elements are interconnected with each other. Thus, a shift to these worldviews and their ways of doing things can be helpful in creating environmental solutions. As a main takeaway, spirituality and traditional stories is influential in how we think in academia. It provides moral values that guides us in the academe. It also provides us a sense of responsibility which can keep us grounded and directed towards the ultimate goal. Lastly, it provides knowledge on how we propose to solve a problem. For the second question, I am handing it over to Emma.
Hello, our second question is, do our programs and institutions accept knowledge from our stories and spirituality? Some of our commonalities are how we use stories to form ethics, as stories hold in our morals and our values of our culture. Stories and spirituality consider life forms other than humans as relatives. Anything that comes from the earth is seen as a relative and can interact with a human. We have teachings, responsibilities, and accountability within our spirituality, and one of the main teachings that we take from spirituality within an academic context is humility. One of the main issues in academia is the lack of humility that I have seen from many professors and academics in general. Academia is an institution where it is very competitive and everyone is competing to be better than another person, whether that be producing more knowledge or writing more. A lot of racialized academics work towards helping their community rather than putting more knowledge into this overflowing pot of knowledge, which is typically gate-kept. There are isolations within spirituality from non-Indigenous beliefs and practices, and that is somewhat of a difficulty within bringing these spiritual topics that are isolated from non-Indigenous practices and trying to figure out how they fit together. Some of our differences are how we view ourselves and identify ourselves within academia. We all have pride in our identity, but in certain spaces, our pride or making ourselves visible is hidden away. In some spaces, we may be really confident and proud to identify and to help out with producing more Indigenous knowledge. In other spaces, we may feel tokenized or we may feel uncomfortable as being maybe the only Indigenous person in the room and being expected to speak for all Indigenous people when we know that our knowledge cannot be pan-Indigenized. Some of us also have concerns of bias where we know that our knowledge is true, but there is a concern where if you write something in an essay or a project, a professor will question where you got that from or mark it wrong, or say you're being biased because you're not removing yourself from your work. Academics separate themselves from their work to not have bias, but as an Indigenous person, you're inherently emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and sometimes physically involved in your work. When you're dealing with your own people, you don't see it as a separation, and it's really difficult to separate yourself because it deals with the people that you really love and care about. I wanted to reflect on this quote by Thomas King, a Cherokee writer. Our stories and spirituality teach us that there is both good and bad in the world, just like academics. It has given me hope to see more non-Indigenous academics take the time to listen, give space, and advocate for Indigenous people within academia. I'll be going into my master's degree in history in the fall, and one of the major hesitations that I had when applying to this discipline deals with this quote. History, especially Indigenous history and spiritual stories, can be told in many different ways. Some academics tell it from a perspective that is harmful to Indigenous people, and others are making space for new emerging voices. We have to be careful about what kinds of medicine and words we are putting out into the world and consider if our stories will harm someone, or consider Indigenous methodologies and perspectives as a priority instead of an afterthought. Some takeaways from this question are that there is more than just academic and colonial methodology, as Indigenous methods are valid and should be seen more than they are and be accepted within academic knowledge. Indigenous ethics have different morals and values than that of academic and colonial methods, and its values it's seen as more community-oriented and caring for people rather than studying people. Staying humble and respectful, those are two of the 7 grandfather teachings, which I think a lot of academics could really benefit from. Ask questions instead of making assumptions about Indigenous people and our spirituality. Ask Indigenous colleagues or students what can be done to make these colonial institutions more comfortable. I'll now pass it over to Jen for our final question.
Jennifer, you're muted.
Sorry. Sorry, in our experience, does academia create space for Indigenous spirituality? We had a range of experiences that informed how and if we found space for Indigenous spirituality within the academy. Common to us all was how we navigated our own spirituality, which depended on variables such as the program we are in, the instructor, and the course. One of my group mates spoke to a larger systemic issue, and I quote, "Colonial institutions are not a safe or healthy space for anyone, but certain groups do get by easier. It may be easier when a student is the we and not the other. It's not the them. We have all had experiences of discomfort where our beliefs and the sources of our knowledge have been dismissed. We have seen spiritual knowledge devalued as it is not seen as scientific. We have experiences with our knowledge systems being diminished when viewed through a colonial lens, and our stories reduced to myths, our teachings recast to superstition. We do feel that our institutions create space for Indigenous spirituality. Jandrea spoke on the classroom setting at the University of the Philippines. In her experience, she found that there's always a sense of respect for Indigenous stories, especially if the discussion is about culture and beliefs. At York, there is space within programs, and Emma has taken a course where Indigenous spirituality is the curriculum. York also has dedicated physical spaces. The picture is of the York Teepee, which is located at Shikanagowa Gaming, translated from Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and meaning the House of Great Peace. It is a building and land that is set aside for Indigenous community where class or ceremony can take place. Within the last few years, York has developed a principles-based framework which commits to respect Indigenous approaches to knowledge and to listen to and learn from our knowledge, ecology, spiritual practice, and experience. While the framework may be aspirational, in some ways, the giant teepee is hard to miss as it is itself a symbol of change. So to sum up, we don't have any one answer on what inclusive spirituality looks like or how to include Indigenous spirituality in the academy. Emma touched on an important idea that we must be careful in how we tell our stories, that we must have safe spaces to do so, and that might be part of the answer. One of the commonalities we all had is that we have a strong connection to a community, which also meant that we had responsibilities in how we share our knowledge and how and if we bring our spirituality into our work and into our institutions. The question I raised is, should we have our own institutions of higher learning? Spaces where we are the we, and we pass our knowledge on to the next generation in our communities, in our nations, in our language. The picture at the top was taken near the end of winter when I was attending a language immersion camp to learn Anishinaabe, and we were doing it on the land on our traditional territory. When taking the language, you really understand that it's more than just words. It's our cosmology, it's spiritual teachings because they are included as part of the language, but it is also a place where we learn our legal principles. We learn science, technology, medicine, history, and governance systems. And these we pass to our children. The picture behind the trees is a quillwork necklace my daughter made the same year. I never learned quill work from my mother or my grandmother. They were both sent to Catholic residential schools, and they were forced to learn a new language, and most of their culture was lost and their spirituality changed. But my daughter learned how to do this while I attended the Manitoulin Island Summer Institute, or Mishi for short, which is a research intensive run through York that brings Indigenous and non-Indigenous academics and artists together to share knowledge, but also it brings together community members and families. This brings me to my final point. Mishi was held in First Nations communities. It was open to all community members, and knowledge was shared on the land and across generations. While I was learning, my daughter was making the little necklace next to the open space where presentations were being made. But she was also listening and learning about Anishinaabe women leaders, and later she was teaching me quill work. Mishi made me consider if maybe there is a way to bring two different knowledge systems together in one space, and partnership may be one of the main ways forward. This is one of the first times I had seen Indigenous knowledge treated with the same respect that Western knowledge was treated. It was also a place where spirituality did not need to be left at the door. I leave you with this popular meme that you may have seen other places, and it's very on point. Indigenous knowledge might not be published at all or to a Western standard, and there is much work to be done in including our knowledge keepers in academia. There are times when our knowledge may only come from oral tradition, and when publishing is a goal in the academy, it may not be the primary goal that we have for sharing our knowledge. For the telling and teaching may be part of our spiritual practices, and the oral transmission is part of ceremony. To conclude, our group members have seen positive changes and growing respect for Indigenous spirituality and practices within our academic experiences. It is my hope this continues across the globe. We thank you for listening to our presentation and invite questions at this time.
Thank you so much to this team. That was just fantastic, amazing. I want to introduce our final faculty commentator. So it's Professor Leah Abeo of the University of the Philippines, Bago. She's a professor in history, and she's involved in the promotion and development of cultural heritage programs, including community archives and museum in Indigenous people's education in the Philippines. She was also part of the International Network on Cultural Diversity that influenced the text of the current UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions. All right, over to you, Leah.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay. I would like to congratulate Emma, Jen, and Jandrea for this well-thought project on bringing spirituality to the academy. I must say that I was deeply touched when I was reading the narratives and the PowerPoint, and especially now that they've presented, and you could see how much they felt about indigenous spirituality in their presentations. So I like it that you framed the project around creating safe spaces for indigenous spirituality in universities. You pointed out the potentials of indigenous spirituality in transforming biased inquiries or perspectives, and in rebuilding the production of knowledge in universities. Your navigations of indigenous spirituality challenges us to reflect much about how universities can allow students to grow as intellectuals and are deeply rooted in indigenous spirituality. There are several aspects in it and contexts in which we can build on what universities have started of creating spaces, but at the same time, it's a challenge to move from that aspect of respecting indigenous spirituality towards creating spaces that really allow students to grow in this particular knowledge and become intellectuals and be able to create something or be able to create the transmission lines of indigenous knowledge in communities. So thank you so much, and congratulations again, Jen, Emma, and Jandrea. I turn this back to Caroline for our for the next part of the program.
Okay, thank you so much, Leah. I'm actually handing it right over to Brianna to handle the Q&A.
So we do still have some time. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, but we do have some time for questions and answers from the audience. And so these questions are to all of the group presenters today. The first one is, a big fear when bringing knowledge onto the internet platforms is that it can be misused out of cultural or community context. What are some measures we could use to both share and preserve Indigenous knowledge, but also keep them safe when it comes to navigating internet platforms?
I think that this question was posed during our presentation, right? Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes, it was.
Perfect. I think it's a tricky subject. One of the things that was brought up during our Q&A at the very top of the presentation was around access to internet, right? And the reliance of our platform on access to internet. And I think with any type of initiative that's trying to dismantle and combat colonialism, there's no one right answer, and there's nothing that's 100% perfect. So I think there are always positive and negatives in any of our approaches. If we were to go solely online, we can connect with a lot more people. However, this question is also right in bringing up that there might be misconstrued cultural or community contexts, right? And that on the other end, if we keep everything within one community, and don't share it with neighboring communities and collaborate with other folks, then the knowledge could be lost and it's not reaching its full potential. So there are drawbacks and benefits to both approaches. Some of the things that I think about when how we can navigate that interesting situation is integrate how we want to use certain materials into the material itself. So if we're creating lesson plans, for example, around like Indigenous language, being very clear and explicit on the community context itself and how to use it appropriately, but also being cognizant of how we disseminate those materials, right? So some of the groups and organizations that we researched, they're not open groups. They are like locked. So you have to apply to get in, and then there are moderators there who monitor how resources are being used and how interactions are within like the space. So that's another route that you could take where you're kind of trying to balance that approach, right? Where we're both sharing and preserving Indigenous knowledges and keeping them safe and trying to do it in a good way.
Thank you so much for your comments, Quela. There are certainly ethical considerations that we need to think about before we engage with sharing Indigenous knowledge on the internet. And I was wondering if maybe any other panelists in the audience would like to comment on that as well. And if not, that is okay too. Caleb gave a wonderful answer, so we can also move on to, I think we have time for about one more question that I will again open up to all panelists. And this question is, how have you handled moments of departure from your Indigenous culture, identity, pedagogical approaches when you've came into mainstream education? So how was that shift for you? and how did you navigate it? I see that Sara has turned on her video. Would you like to speak to the question?
Yeah, maybe I could have it, like, could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear it all.
So the question is, how have you navigated moments of departure from your Indigenous culture and identity in when you came to a Western academic institution? And I think what this question is speaking to perhaps is, how do you find walking in two worlds and keeping your Indigenous identity while you're in the academy?
Thank you. For me, it's been useful to understand that we are the culture, and we create new stories, realities. So oftentimes there is this fear of not following the steps, or of losing your culture. But I think even your existence is part of the history of your culture. That has been very helpful, but at the same time, it is important to find a community that can help you to remind yourself of the value that you have as part of an Indigenous culture. So I think that was one of the challenges that I found when I went to study in this city, to feel proud of the voice that I have. I think it was a process. Well, for many others, they were learning about maybe their interests of study. For me, it was a process of being empowered in who I am and what I want to do in the future. And understanding that I'm creating narratives. I am part of that constant process of creating new stories for my own people. So I'm in that process, I think, and navigating has been between those two worlds has been definitely very challenging. I cried so many times. But I think just have to have your story, the stories of your grandparents, the stories of your parents, or even the common collective stories in your heart will always remind you that you're not alone, and that it is okay to have different type of spaces. There are some spaces where you will feel more safe, and others where you will not. And I think you just have to pick those spaces. Not all the time you have that chance to choose, but there, I think I found those the things that I mentioned as tips that help me to navigate. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And there were a couple points that I wanted to touch on as well that I think were extremely important. The first one being having that sense of community when you're walking in two worlds at once, because when you're in spaces where your indigeneity is questioned, or you're asked to justify your experiences, it can be really emotionally exhausting. These Western academic spaces can be quite emotionally and spiritually draining, but this is made so much easier to navigate when you have a strong group behind you and a strong support network and that sense of community. So I appreciate you bringing up that point. And then also, I just wanted to speak to the point about and I think this was brought up in the spirituality group as well, that when you go into certain classes, whether it be history, whether it be sociology, a lot of methodologies ask you to look at the subject matter from an objective lens, so to take yourself out of that, or they ask you not to make what you're talking about always about indigeneity or always Indigenous, but asking you to separate your indigeneity from your knowledge is asking you to fragment your identity and to take apart a crucial part of how you even came to that knowledge, because knowledge always is produced from a certain worldview. So I think those 2 points were very important, and thank you for bringing them up. And I will also see if any other member of the audience would like to speak to navigating two worlds and the trials and tribulations, and sometimes the I guess ways forward that comes out of it. So sometimes there are successes.
I guess I can say something to this. So it's kind of I guess it happens in waves. So when I first started university and like where I am now, I actually found myself with a community, which is really weird to say, but I grew up in Western institutions. So I went to school in Ontario, in Brampton, actually, like it's a huge city. And I grew up with Western ways of knowing. And without having access to urban community in Ontario. So I discovered that when I finally got to York and I could finally connect to community members in Toronto, and I had access to not only culture, but also other Indigenous people. And that was like mind-blowing for me. But then on the other hand, again, when you enter academic spaces as an Indigenous person, especially if you're learning about colonial history or Indigenous history, there's always that awkwardness, especially if you happen to be the only Indigenous person in the room. And I think people don't recognize the microaggressions that happen in these spaces, especially when they don't know you're Indigenous. And the things that people say in these institutions, or the things that they think, or the things perpetuated by professors and other academics who should know better, but unfortunately don't. And now you're just in a space where you're like constantly feeling belittled, or Indigenous spirituality and knowledge is not at the forefront of the class, despite it being like a huge part of it. Like, how can you look at colonial history or Indigenous history and not have our methodologies, and not look at our sources and our stories and our information? And it's really hard as a student to address that because of the power dynamics that are involved with student and professor. So that's an issue, but I think it helped having that community on campus, where like you go and you can talk to someone about it, and someone knows what you're going through, and you're recognized, and what you're going through is recognized. So I think it is a very fine line that you walk when you're in a Western institution. And my experience is not going to be like every other Indigenous person's experience. I got lucky, essentially. Like, having that community at York really got me through my education in the first place.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your comments. I think there is so much wisdom in what you said. I really do. And I think it speaks to the different points of connectivity to community, and that not all Indigenous people have access to their communities because of colonial related reasons. If you're First Nations, there are huge barriers to gaining status. And so you may find yourself segregated from the knowledge and the connections that have been kept within your community. So these urban spaces can really provide those starting points of reconnection and those feelings of belonging, and can instill that pride of being Indigenous. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And then just briefly, another point is I feel like often the emotional and spiritual labor that Indigenous students have to perform in academic spaces isn't always acknowledged as well. So, you know, when you're in the classroom and you hear something disparaging, something about Indigenous peoples that is disparaging, you know, that there's a lot of, you're almost expected to keep your calm and then come up with all these diplomatic arguments as to why that is. But you're not allowed to be upset or visibly enraged. And so there's a lot of emotional and spiritual labor that comes with that as well. And I will just see if there is anyone else in the audience who would like to speak to that so I don't keep rambling on.
I actually had a couple of things that I wanted to share about this question, if that's all right. So just to give everyone a little review, I'm Aleria, I'm from Six Nations. I grew up on a reserve. My whole life I've lived on Six Nations. I grew up in a school surrounded by other kids who were Haudenosaunee, and when I went to high school for the first time, I went to school off reserve, and I always tell people, I always give the same comparison. It was like an Australian seeing snow for the first time. I had never really interacted with people who were not from my community, from my reserve. And that was very jarring for me. You know, it was difficult in that, you know, I had such different things, different experiences with these non-native kids, mostly white kids. And I remember my first day of school, I was sitting down at lunch with some kids and we were chatting about what schools we had gone to. And I said that, oh, I'm from Six Nations, I'm from the reserve. And one of the girls turns to me and she says, oh, you're Native. And I said, yes. And she said, oh, my parents hate Native people because they don't pay taxes. And I was 13 years old and I didn't even know how to respond to something like that, because not only had I not experienced it, but I didn't know that people had these mindsets, because again, I had grown up on reserve. I had grown up with people who shared experiences that were very, very similar to mine. And I never had that before. And I remember I couldn't say anything to that because I didn't even know where to begin in those kinds of conversations yet. And over the next 5 years of high school, I really had shifted in my mindset and how I acted around people, because I had to almost conform to what the people around me, their beliefs, what they were saying and doing. And I lost a lot of the things from my community. We have our little sayings, we have the way we talk, we have all these different things. And that's something that I lost over the years, and that really broke my heart. And, you know, now I'm here at York and it's definitely changed me over the years, you know, coming into myself again, reconnecting with my community. And that has been my biggest thing that has supported me throughout all of this, has been having my family and my community and having them remind me that home is still home for me and that I still have that connection no matter where I go, no matter the people I'm around, even when I'm in a class with 200 kids and I'm the only Native person. You know, that has been something that's been an experience here. And, you know, although that it can be difficult at times, especially when I'm expected to talk on issues that either I'm not prepared to talk about or I just don't have the emotional space to. I know that that can be difficult for a lot of Native students, a lot of BIPOC students as well. And just knowing that I have the people at home that I can come to at the end of a long day of dealing with these kinds of things and talking to them about it, debriefing when those kinds of situations happen, that has been such a big support for me. And I'm very thankful for the people around me, for my mom. I know she watched this tonight and she was very excited to hear all the presentations. She said everyone did a very good job. But yeah, just having that and having my community behind me, knowing that I'm paving the way for the next Native girl who wants to go into the arts, who wants to go into theater, knowing that I'm making those steps and seeing that, because I don't have anybody right now that I can see in my realm of work that I'm doing. I don't have anybody necessarily that I can look up to right now, but I just keep reminding myself that here in these spaces places, I'm going to be somebody that the next person can look towards for that reminder and that support. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much for sharing, Aleria. And you certainly are going to be such a powerful role model for so many other Haudenosaunee women and girls and men and Anishinaabe Kwe. So we really thank you for all that you have to share and all that you're paving. And I think this is bringing us to the end of this session, but I would like to see if anyone else would like to add some last remarks before we end off. And I see that Professor Gabrielle Fletcher would like to add a few things to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Brianna. And look, thank you so much to all the student commentary that we've just heard in the last few moments as well. I'd just like to add to that in terms of the context of being within the academy, being within institutions. And as you pointed out yourself, what's coming through is this strength of community and just and it's the importance of that. This occurs in the informal spaces outside of classrooms as well. Those things can be challenging. Systems and systemics can be challenging, but I just sort of think about the healing spaces outside of that, coming through and coursing through in the institutions in these specific spaces that hopefully every university has or should have as well, and that we're all in the process, I think, of holding space as well, which is really important, not to be underestimated. But I just wanted to, just in hearing people speak and their own subjectivities and being open and in a safe environment now to be able to speak of it. And I'm really struck by the healing that's going on right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those wonderful words. And I think that is a perfect note to end off on. So we do have some closing remarks. I see Carolyn would like to say a few words, and then I will also pass it over to Benita Gingatharan. And Carolyn will introduce her.
All right, so Benita Gingatharan is the Executive Director of York International, and she focuses on strategic leadership and operational planning for international student success and enhancing student mobility opportunities. So she also provides support to the Provost's office in developing and executing the internationalization strategy. And she's worked at many universities over the years, and including University of Toronto and Ryerson, and we're incredibly lucky to have her here at York. So I'll hand it over to Benita right now.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's been an honor to be part of this knowledge sharing session. And I want to thank all the students for sharing the space and place with me and the others that are present today. On behalf of the team and the organizers, the partners, we're so grateful to all of you for your generosity and your openness in sharing your knowledge, your lived experiences, and your person being through the projects and presentations you've put together. Incredibly thoughtful work showcase that makes it clear just how much we still have to do for decolonization in Canada and around the world. Thank you so much to Brianna and Carolyn for doing such an excellent job facilitating the Knowledge Fair program. Once again, I would like to thank our students for their participation, engagement, and commitment to the program, and for your willingness to simply say yes to participating in this program in such short notice, as has already been mentioned. Without your willingness and openness to discuss and share your ideas and experiences, this program would not have been the success that it is, or even possible. I'd like to mention all the students who participated by name: Aleria, Mckay, Amy House, Angel Solís, C. Elizabeth Best, C. Jennifer Bolton, Caleb Wesley, Christina da Costa, Elizabeth Barrera, Emma Litschko, Felipe Bañez García, Jandrea Rose Oddoc, Jennifer Sedgewick, Quenses Quela, Rosalyn González Mora, Samay Ainaguano Baltazar, Sara Fuentes Maldonado. Thank you all very much. To our partner universities and faculty facilitators, we're so grateful for your commitment and support to this project. We do look forward to coming together with you for the program's future iteration and other exciting initiatives that we could come together on. So thank you very much to Tecnológico de Monterrey, Universidad de San Francisco de Quito, University of the Philippines, Baguio, University of Costa Rica. And we are so looking forward to also working with Deakin University and the University of New South Wales in the next edition of this program. Congratulations to my York colleagues, Brianna, Carolyn, Katie, Helen, Mary Rose, for your collaboration and friendship throughout this program. To Randy and Lily, we appreciate your commitment and support to this program from its inception through to where we are today. The team can only be confident and assured that we'll be equipped for future success with your continued support. And finally, thank you to our UIT colleagues and our Glendon School of Translation students for enabling our technology and language interpretation needs for today. We appreciate the support for today's event as well. Thank you so much to everybody for staying and participating and sharing as long as you have. I do hope that all of our paths cross again, and that we all stay in touch and continue to share in our knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vinitha. And I think Vinitha thanked everyone who I would have liked to have thanked myself. I just would like to take this time also to say that I really would like to acknowledge the vulnerability and the courage that went into sharing, that the students put into sharing all of their experiences tonight, and really truly thank you for them. So miigwech and nioengoa. We really appreciate all the energy and the time and commitment that you've put into this. I also want to quickly thank the team behind the scenes really making this night possible. Helen Valderrama, Katie Gribbins, and Marie Rostella, the interpreters, the closed captioners, and also the tech team behind this night as well. So a huge thank you to all of them, to our faculty partners. And then just for the audience, thank you for your interaction with us and for your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but we really appreciated them. And for those who have left comments in the Q&A, I will make sure that they get passed on to the team as well. So thank you so much. And there are just two resources that I'd like to direct you to in the chat. The first one is that if you'd like to know more about the program, you can visit the website, which has been posted in the chat by Katie Gribbins. It's just a few comments up. And then we would also like to have all of our attendees complete the anonymous post-event survey. We are always looking to improve, and I know that everyone involved appreciates any messages that the audience has to share, and it will certainly help guide us with the program as we move forward. And so the survey is available in both English and Spanish. So thank you so much for attending, and have a great rest of your evening.